Okay, so question of the week this week relates to Naihanchi in the Goju Ryu system. So certain schools within Goju Ryu apparently include Naihanchi as part of it. When I was part of the Jinrokan, it was not part of what we did. But I understand some older schools of the Yagi system, the Meibukan, have versions of Naihanchi within the system, and some of the Higa schools. Now, when I trained with Hokama Sensei, I can vividly remember one session where he was explaining parts of Naihanchi to a group, and he asked me to demonstrate Naihanchi, and I didn't know it, so he got extremely cross with me, which was a little bit bizarre because it didn't help me to magically be able to do Naihanchi on the spot like that. But from his reaction, it was clearly a part of his system. I didn't ask him about it, I didn't ask him to teach me. But from his reaction, I would suggest that it was probably part of what he knew. Now, we see some maybe written evidence. It depends how you read it. Where Miyagi Sensei talks about the foundational kata of Sanchin, Tensho, and Naihanchi. Now, whether he's writing that in terms of it's what he taught as foundational kata, or whether he's writing it in terms of what would be considered foundational kata for the Okinawan karate in its entirety, I think it's more that. I think if we look at the Naihanchi, I, it's a gut feeling of mine, but same as in England, a lot of us know how to play football, right? We instinctively kick a football as part of our culture. In Okinawa, I think a lot of people would have had at least a rudimentary understanding of Naihanchi and Sanchin, just because it being the two most prominent kata on the island. Naihanchi more so than Sanchin, I would suggest. So through the school system, through exposure to relatives, through just maintaining an exercise routine, I think a lot of people would have had some form of understanding of Naihanchi. Now, when we talk about Goju Ryu and its inclusion or exclusion from the system, whether it was part of it and then omitted at a later date, when we look at Miyagi Sensei and what he was trying to do with this system, obviously there was a lot of collaboration with Shorin Ryu, certainly in the formation of the Geksai kata, and then apparently wanting to formulate a lot more foundational kata as a crossover, a collaboration between the two schools. So they would be kind of like the unified kata of Okinawan karate that everybody could learn as part of the school system. Before then, perhaps they looked to specialize in a specific school, be it Goju Ryu or Shaolin Ryu or whatever. But there was a consensus that they wanted these 10 foundational kata. First two being the Geksai Dish, Geksai Dai Ni, which were formulated along with Nagamine Shoshin, who was a very good friend of Choujin Miyagi, even though a lot younger than him. Hokama Sensei told me Cypher was formulated by Miyagi Sensei in 1940. That was the first time I heard this. It came from Hokama Sensei. This was back in 2008. He told me this. Miyagi Sensei formulated Cypher in 1940. Up until that time, general consensus was that it was brought back from China by Higo Nakamura. Now, whether you can find any written kind of like link to a cipher earlier than that date, if you can, please let me know. But I've not seen any mention of cipher prior to 1940. If we look at the Tokui kata, or the kata that Miyagi Sensei assigned to each individual student, if we look back prior to World War II, what kata were being assigned to people, cipher was not one where somebody specialized in. When he went to Hawaii, if you look at the oral testimony about what he was teaching there in terms of foundations, people say they were taught Sanchin, Tensho, Seiyunchin, and Seisan. And they say that the Seiyunchin and Seisan were Miyagi's core kata at that time with regards to what he taught and what he believed represented the Goju Ryu system. So somewhere around 1940, we start to see cipher popping up. Certainly post-war, we see it popping up a lot more. It was told to me by Ko that Miyagi Sensei created cipher as a Goju Ryu version of Naihanchi. So he wanted to formulate a kata that specialized in this lateral movement, or movement whereby you were fighting with your back against the wall or in tight confined narrow alleyways that you would find in Okinawa at that time. And you guys who have been to the Kinjo pavement where they still have the stone walls, this kind of narrow pavement whereby you're almost forced into a ring situation by virtue of these higher walls. And we have a downslope back, you have an uphill in front, but you have these higher walls to side to side. So apparently he wanted to formulate a kata that would make use of these positions or means of getting out of these positions. Something that come to mind when I was considering my response to a question was if we look at the popularity of Naihanchi and assuming that a lot of people had at least a surface understanding of the kata. If we look at the likelihood of around that time challenge matches and kaki demeshi, that kind of thing, which Miyagi Sensei was no stranger to. There were a lot of people who tried to challenge him, who used to try to sneak up on him. Certainly his students, you could read testimonies from Taguchi, from Yagi, from all the different students who were subject to challenges. So if we assume that Naihanchi is something that a lot of people knew, it would be reasonable to assume that we would want to create a counterpart to that or a counter to that. So it's just something for consideration. Could we consider that Cypher might be the antidote to Naihanchi? It's just a thought that pops into my head. It's not one I've formulated fully yet. It's not one that I've really sat down and thought about, but it pops into my head yesterday. What if Miyagi Sensei created that as an antidote to Naihanchi? So it might be something interesting to look at in terms of application, principles and tactics, something maybe you can ask your kata and have a little think and have a little play with over the coming weeks. If we look at power generation, so if for example, Miyagi Sensei created Cypher to make Naihanchi redundant. So if it was part of his system, he wanted a Goju Ryu version of it so he could get rid of Naihanchi and almost sever those links to the Shorin Ryu in terms of his system. If we look at the power generation methods of Cypher, we see it's actually very similar to Naihanchi in terms of the whipping movements, this loose Shorin-like power generation, which is somewhat unique within the Goju system. If we look elsewhere in the system, it's very Sanchin dominant. Cypher kind of breaks that mold a little bit, and certainly with regards to how we're throwing the strikes, it's a lot looser, a lot more whipping, a lot more Ju, a lot more Naihanchi. So again, just something to consider if we create this kata as our version of it. Are the mechanics, are the power generation methods somewhat similar, albeit a little bit Goju-fied? Okay. Anyway, that's just my thoughts on the subject with regards to Naihanchi. Like I say, it's not a kata I practice, not one that I've ever learned. It's not one I've ever tried to teach myself. But yeah, interesting. I wonder about that antidote to Naihanchi. I might have a little play with that myself. Okay. Anyway, any more questions, guys? Keep them coming, and I'll rack up the questions throughout the week and address them again next Monday. See you later.